So we'll start off with a Daily Show clip just to introduce the issue.
Best-selling author whose new book is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. Please welcome back to the show the fantastic Reza Aslan! Reza.
John.
Thank you for being here. The book.
Let's talk about Jesus.
Let's talk about Jesus. Let's
You've heard of him.
Let's get some. I think everybody's heard of Jesus. I think everyone in the world has a relationship with Jesus, whether they want one or not.
Yeah, right.
And let's be clear. This book is about Jesus, the man, not so much Jesus the Christ.
It's about the historical Jesus, not the Christ of faith. But I mean, the fact of the matter is that whether you believe that Jesus was God incarnate, God made flesh, or not, you believe that he was also a man. And if he was a man, then he lived in a specific time and place. And that time and place kind of matters, you know? I mean, it's like, if you really want to know who he was, you have to put his words and his actions in the context of the world in which he lived. The teachings have to be seen according to the social ills that he confronted and the political forces that he confronted.
Right, at the time, I loved this book.
Thanks.
And the time and place in which he lived, it was total chaos. Possibly the most chaotic time in that region, and that region is the Middle East.
Yeah,
that's a high crazy bar.
This was probably the most tumultuous era in the Holy Land, which, as you say, is saying a lot. A time of apocalyptic fervor, a time in which we're slowly moving towards this huge Jewish revolt against the Roman Empire that ultimately resulted in the leveling of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple, the exile of the Jews. And every word that was ever written about Jesus in the Gospels was written after that event.
Right. Because, I mean, you talk about him here, how in the Bible Jesus refers to as, a detached...
Okay, so let's cut it off here and now watch the Fox News interview that kind of caused a bit of controversy and propelled Reza to even more fame.
Reza Aslan was a Christian but converted back to the faith of his forefathers. It's Islam. He has now written a book about Jesus. The book has become controversial as it calls into question some of the core tenets of Christianity. And the book is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. And Reza joins me now from Los Angeles. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this is an interesting book. Now, I want to clarify, you're a Muslim, so why did you write a book about the founder of Christianity?
Well, to be clear, I am a scholar of religions with 4 degrees, including one in the New Testament and fluency in Biblical Greek, who has been studying the origins of Christianity for 2 decades, who also just happens to be a Muslim. So it's not that I'm just some Muslim writing about Jesus. I am an expert with a PhD in the history of religions. But I've been obsessed with Jesus.
It still begs the question, why would you be interested in the founder of Christianity?
Because it's my job as an academic. I am a professor of religion, including the New Testament. That's what I do for a living, actually. So, I mean, it would be like asking a Christian why they would write a book about, Islam. I'm not sure about that. But honestly, I've been obsessed with Jesus for really 20 years. I've been studying his life and his work and the origins of Christianity, both in an academic environment and at a personal level for about 2 decades. And just to be clear, this is not some attack on Christianity. My mother is a Christian. My wife is a Christian. My brother-in-law is an evangelical pastor. Anyone who thinks that this book is an attack on Christianity has not read it yet.
I want to read you some quotes from some people who are criticizing you. One from John Dickerson, who has written an op-ed piece on FoxNews.com, and he says, it's not a historian's report on Jesus. Is it an educated Muslim's opinion about Jesus? He says its conclusions are long-held Islamic claims, namely that Jesus was a zealous prophet type who didn't claim to be God.
Well, that's actually not what Islam claims about Jesus. My book about Jesus overturns pretty much everything that Islam also thinks about Jesus as well. And to be clear, I just want to emphasize this one more time. I am a historian. I am a PhD in the history of religions. This isn't a Muslim opinion. This is an academic work of history, not about the Christ or about Christianity for that matter. It's about a historical man who walked the earth 2,000 years ago in a land that the Romans called Palestine.
How are your findings different from what Islam actually believes about Jesus?
Well, Islam doesn't believe that Jesus was crucified, first of all. Islam believes in the virgin birth. I mean, Jesus was most definitely crucified, and my book does question the historicity of the virgin birth. So again, I mean, I know that we've mentioned this 3 times now. I'm not sure what my faith happens to do with my 20 years of academic study of the New Testament.
I'm just trying to bring out what some others are claiming at this point, and I want you to answer to those claims, which is...
Well, it's pretty clear that there are those who actually do not like the book, who are, unhappy with its general arguments. That's perfectly fine. I'm more than willing to talk about the arguments of the book itself, but I do think it's perhaps a little bit strange that rather than debating the arguments of the book, we are debating the right of the scholar to actually write it.
Well, let me give you some other quotes from Dr. William Lane Craig, who is a Christian philosopher and theologian. He's written a lot of books and done a lot of debates about science and religion. He said Reza Aslan merely repeats bygone claims about the historical Jesus that have since been abandoned and refuted. What do you say to that?
Well, I would disagree. I have 100 pages of notes and about 1,000 books that I use in my discussions. And of course, in any scholarly discussion of Jesus, as with any scholarly discussion of any ancient figure, there are going to be widespread differences. But my 100 pages of endnotes cites every scholar who disagrees with me and every scholar who agrees with me. And I would suggest that anyone who wants to actually comment on the argument of the book read not just the book, but the endnotes, and to figure out where my scholarly argument about Jesus comes from. And I'm sure you're going to find people who disagree with me.
Right, exactly. What are your... we're not talking about just people who disagree with you. Many scholars disagree with you as well. But I want to get to the heart of what are your conclusions about Jesus?
Well, my conclusions about Jesus start by placing him in the world in which he lived. So I start with one fundamental truth that everyone agrees on with Jesus, and that was that he was crucified. You have to understand that crucifixion in first century Palestine was a punishment that Rome reserved exclusively for crimes against the state, like sedition or rebellion, treason, or insurrection. The thieves who were crucified alongside Jesus were not thieves. The Greek word blestes means bandit. And bandit was the most common term in Jesus' time for an insurrectionist. What I say is that if you know nothing else about Jesus except that he was crucified, you know enough to understand what a troublemaker this guy must have been. The movement that he started was such a threat to the political stability of the empire that they actually had him arrested, tortured, and killed for it. So I start with that fundamental fact, and then I take the claims of the Gospels, as every single biblical scholar for 200 years has done, and look at them in light of the history of this world that we know. And what's interesting about Jesus' world is that we know a lot about it, thanks to the Romans, who were very good at documentation. And the picture that arises from this is of a real political revolutionary who took on the religious and political powers of his time on behalf of the poor and the meek, the dispossessed, the marginalized, who sacrificed himself in his cause for those who couldn't stand up for himself, and whose death ultimately launched the greatest religion in the world.
Yeah, I want you to ask, actually there's another chat coming, and I want to get this on before we end this interview. Taylor Kane just says, so your book is written with clear bias, and you're trying to say it's academic. That's like having a Democrat write a book about why Reagan wasn't a good Republican. It just doesn't work.
Well,
what do you say to that?
It would be like It would be like a Democrat with a PhD in Reagan who has been studying his life and history for 2 decades writing a book about Reagan.
But then why would a Democrat want
unfair.
to promote democracy by writing about a Republican? I see that the point is that...
Ma'am, may I just finish my sentence for a moment, please? I think that the fundamental problem here is that you're assuming that I have some sort of faith-based bias in this work that I write. I write about Judaism, I write about Hinduism, I write about Christianity, I write about Islam. My job as a scholar of religions with a PhD in the subject is to write about religions. And one of the religions that I have written about is the religion that was
you're not just writing about a religion from a point of view of an observer. I mean, the thing about it is that you're promoting yourself as a scholar, and I've interviewed scholars who have written books on the resurrection, on the real Jesus, and who are looking at the same information that you're saying. To say that your information is somehow different from theirs is really not being honest here.
Ma'am, my information is not different from theirs at all. I'm afraid that it sounds like you haven't actually read my book or seen what I've said about the resurrection or about Jesus or about his claims. I think you might be surprised in what I say. And there have been thousands of scholars who have written about this very same topic, many who disagree with me, many who agree with me. That's the thing about scholarship, is that it's a debate over ancient history, and I am one of those people making that debate. I think it's unfair to just simply assume, because of my particular faith background, that there is some agenda on this book. That would be like saying that a Christian who writes about Muhammad is by definition, not able to do so because he has some bias against it. And frankly, every book that's
but I believe that you've been on several programs and have never disclosed that you were a Muslim, and I think that's an interesting full disclosure.
The second page of my book says I'm a Muslim. Every single interview I have ever done on TV or on print says I'm a Muslim. You may not be familiar with me, but I'm actually quite a prominent Muslim thinker in the United States. I've written a number of books about Islam. It's just simply incorrect to say that media isn't saying that I'm a Muslim. I would actually encourage you to actually try to find media that doesn't mention my biography, which, by the way, again, is on the second page of the book.
All right, Reza, I want to thank you very much for coming on. The book is called Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. I want to thank you for coming on a spirited debate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Now, just to give a little bit of background of Reza Aslan and what didn't come out during that debate was Reza has a unique background in that he's in the Muslim that was for a couple of years an evangelical Christian. So he converted to Christianity and then went back to become a Muslim again. So it's now, the question she's asking, for a brief period of time, he was actually a Christian. Just to give you his background, he studied religious studies at Santa Clara University, got his PhD from UC Santa Barbara, also has a degree in creative writing as well. So that kind of gives his background. But now to kind of give you a greater context of this interview, or kind of his opinions on faith, I want to read you something he said after the controversy that ensued after this interview, okay? And because what I think he says here in this talk he gave is quite profound, but the kind of, the profound nature of these kind of statements, of course, don't get much media attention, okay? Now, in his words, look what he says here. For me, faith is ineffable. It's indescribable. If you're talking about God, you are talking about something that is by definition beyond everything. All religion, as far as I'm concerned, is a language made up of symbols and metaphors that help us to express what is fundamentally inexpressible to ourselves and to each other. What's important is not to confuse the language for the thing itself, not to confuse the religion for what the religion is expressing. The way I express that thought is through the symbols and metaphors that are provided by Islam. I'm not a Muslim because I think Islam is more right than Christianity. It's not. I'm a Muslim simply because the metaphors that Islam provides for God, humanity, the relationship between creator and creations, they make more sense to me. In the same way, I speak Christianity and Judaism and Hinduism and Buddhism, but I feel in Islam. So now, do you see what he's saying here? Why is that? Why do I find it quite profound? Because I have the same idea. I mean, I'm not. No, this is what I hate when somebody, when two people come up with the same idea. But anyway, when he talks about, he's expressing a new language. He's saying, I don't believe in Islam. I feel Islam. And that one word can make a huge difference. I mean, if you think about it, when we usually talk about faith-based matter, it's usually when an individual describes his or her affiliation to a particular faith, it is usually used by the term belief, okay? Now, and despite the language, whether we're talking about in Hebrew or in Arabic, in other words, both Jews, Christians, and Muslims, usually when they describe their relation to a faith, it's belief, okay? That's you believe in a particular faith, you believe in God. But you think how language sets up the relationship. In other words, I believe in the tooth fairy. I believed in the Santa Claus. And then one day I stopped believing in them. My Muslim uncle said, Muslims don't believe in Santa Claus, and that was the end of Santa Claus. You believe in communism or you believe in democracy. You believe in political ideas. You believe in mythical characters. And then you believe in God. But do you see what happens then? Because the minute you say I believe in God, then the question arises, okay, do you have the same belief in God that I do? And the minute then the language sets up a binary opposition. Do you believe in God in the way I conceptualize God? Okay. In that moment, you've set up the underlying ethos of every single clash of religious belief. That's what you're seeing in that interview. It's a clash over belief. And because the word belief has been so ingrained in the way we think about religion. Now, if we took Reza's term about feeling religion, okay, something I came up, and I'll give you the conditions in which I came up with it. The thing is, if you say I feel God, then you're changing the nature of faith altogether. You can feel happiness. You can feel love. Okay? But who is judge if your feelings of love or happiness are more correct than mine or yours? Okay? In other words, feelings are universal. They can be shared by anyone. If since time immemorial, when these three religions emerged in the Mediterranean basin, if we started to say, do we feel God rather than believe God, that would have changed, I would say, quite a lot of the dynamics between the three faiths. If faith is a feeling, and if you feel God, then no one can deny your feelings. Nobody can say your feeling is more is wrong. Wrong. My feeling is more correct. Is my happiness more happy than your happiness? Okay. But nevertheless, no. We live in an age where belief sets up the binary oppositions between faiths. Now, how did I come to also conceptualize the idea of feeling Islam, and that religion can be felt? Was for the longest time as I was growing up, there was a secret in my family, something that was hidden, that I had a Christian grandmother. Okay. Growing up in a Muslim family, this was a secret. Not even my mom didn't even know her real mom's name. Okay, this is how the effort was made to keep the fact that there was I had a Christian grandmother in my family. And I went to Lebanon to discover if I had any remaining relatives of my grandmother. And sure enough, it's a long story, but sure enough I found the older sister of my grandmother in Lebanon. Just randomly. I found her, hunted her down, and she was extremely happy to see me. Now, I thought she would consider me kind of the bastard child of an illicit marriage, a marriage that's usually frowned upon, particularly in Lebanon, in an ultra-religious country, ultra-Catholic, ultra-Maronite country. But no, in fact, she had been waiting for 40 years for one of her sister's kids to find her. And what she showed me in her little apartment was a statue of the Virgin Mary with a candle that she would light for 40 years, hoping that I would find her. Not me particularly, but somebody of her sister's kids would come and find her. And it was that moment, it didn't matter if I was a Muslim or a Christian, there was something we felt together. That's something that overcame religion, okay? And it was at that moment, that kind of the feelings that we had for each other, that I kind of thought, it's, you know, it's too bad that, yeah, religion wasn't just something that, God isn't something that we feel. Because if it's something that we feel, then the tensions that existed between mine and her family would have never existed in the first place. But why am I bringing this issue is something I came to the realization was, my grandmother was Christian but belonged to the Syriac Orthodox Church. Now the Syriac Orthodox Church, why am I bringing this up? Where did it start? In other words, where was the first Christian church ever established? In Antioch, in what is today Syria. In other words, the birthplace of Christianity, literally as the definition of a faith that describes itself as Christianity, was the Middle East. Now, how was this form of Christianity practiced? What happened in the first church? How was Christianity performed in the first church? Well, the first church looked very much like a mosque. There was no such thing as pews. People prayed on the floor, and those first Christians prayed 7 times a day. Now, of course, for those of you who don't know, Muslims pray 5 times a day, okay? But what was also interesting was not only is the first church so, resembled so much in Muslim practice, but it made me realize how much this is kind of the beginning of the journey where I, began to reconceptualize Christianity and its Middle Eastern roots. Having said that, when you see this debate here, what I find ironic is how often it's forgotten that Jesus was a Middle Easterner. Okay. So in other words, is it really so strange that a Muslim is writing about Jesus? Or at the end of the day, what's really happening here is a Middle Easterner writing about a Middle Easterner who lived in the past. It's often forgotten Christianity's Middle Eastern roots. Now, if we bring geography into this, then what do we have? We have 3 religions that more or less emerged in an area the size of California. The distance between Mecca and Jerusalem is about the exact size of the state of California. And it's not only the size important, it's these cities are interconnected, these cultures are interconnected. It's not unusual that Muslim culture would have so much similarities to Christian culture as it was practiced in the Middle East. So why is that important? Because again, it gets back to this notion of the binary oppositions between Judaism and Islam, Judaism and Christianity, Christianity and Islam. And I often use this analogy, and it's a bit crude, but it kind of illustrates the point. I often compare, because usually the kind of, in my life of kind of giving talks in interfaith context, usually I'm speaking to an audience who see Islam as a repudiation of Christianity. Islam is usually the notion of Islam something inherently by its sheer nature as opposed to Christianity. And always when, and usually these are older people and it's much harder to change their minds. Well, it might be harder to change your minds too. But anyway, so usually what I use as an analogy is always this cultural reference. Does the film Return of the Jedi repudiate Star Wars? In other words, can Star Wars exist? Can Return of the Jedi exist independently of Star Wars? Or does any of the characters in Return of the Jedi, are they inherently opposed? Okay, let me get to the point like this. If we think of the Jedi as prophets, okay, then what do they share? They share a common cause. So they are, they share an allegiance to this undescribable, all-powerful entity called the Force. Okay? And they're uniformly opposed to the dark side. Okay, in other words, if you think of, Muhammad, Jesus, and, Moses as Jedis, as Obi-Wan, Luke, and, Yoda, they aren't inherently opposed to each other. They might be different. They might have different ideas. Okay, but at the end of the day, they came from the same cultural milieu. And that's, what we have to remember about the 3 faiths of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. They both are born of the same cultural environment. So it's hard to talk about them being as kind of diametrically opposed to each other. Now, what we also tend to forget is when Islam emerged in the 600s, the Christianity as we know it today was quite different in 600. Today, again, the kind of ingrained notion is Islam is inherently opposed to Christianity. But you have to realize, if we're talking about 600, what was the situation in 600? There was no Christianity. There was Christianities. And this is most often forgotten. That the real battle in the 600s wasn't between Islam and Christianity. What had been the most vicious battle up until that point was between different forms of Christianity, different types of Christians massacring other types of Christians for the charge of you are practicing Christianity in the wrong way. In other words, when Islam emerged, it wasn't necessarily opposed to Christianity because there was no such thing as Christianity then. There was multiple Christianities, and what divided those multiple Christianities was the nature of Jesus. You had some forms of Christianity that said Jesus was entirely human. You have some forms of Christianity that says Jesus is entirely divine. There's no human aspect to it. And the Christianity that survives to this day was a medium point between those two. But nevertheless, those forms of Christianities were very much in struggle with each other. In other words, when Islam emerged, Islam simply happened to be a religion that was closer to the form of Christianity that never won the political battle. And that's an important thing to remember, okay? Because once we do that, once we start thinking about religion, if we could start thinking about religion in terms of the kind of emotions it brings about, if we start to think about religions in the historical context that they emerge, these kind of debates that we see on Fox News start to become, they're rendered irrelevant. And I would hope so they would be irrelevant in the future. So having said that, I'll conclude there. Kim, do you want to show the videos, and then or just open up the discussion?
Yeah, let's open up discussion. Thanks so much for